I'm Ellie.
And I'm Morgan, and welcome to Tech Time US History.
Now today we are going to attempt to do something impossible.
Impossible? What are we going to be doing?
Well, today we are going to be fitting 500 years of history from the Columbian Exchange to the US entrance into World War I in just 10 minutes.
Cool, so if you're studying for a test or you just like learning in general, then this is the video for you.
Now, in order to understand U.S. history, we need to go back to the moment when Europeans first arrived in the New World, where about 20 million Native Americans were already living. This brings us to the Columbian Exchange. Europeans brought many new crops and agricultural products back to the Old World with them, while they brought diseases, livestock, and of course people to the New World.
Over the next 200 years, Europeans began to create colonies along the eastern coast of the future United States, which were typically traded by different religious groups. The headright system allowed for indentured servants to be brought over from the Old World, the understanding that they could get land once they had finished their term in servitude. In the colonies, Baptists and Anglicans populated the south, while Protestants, Quakers, and Catholics populated the northern colonies. These religious separation caused wide variation in laws and liberties from colony to colony.
During this period of colonization in the New World, there were tensions between the natives and the settlers. Colonists didn't understand native culture, and especially their views of land and property. Colonists from the beginning were expressing dominance over Native Americans in order to gain land and labor. This can be seen through force such as in the Spanish encomienda system and in unfair treaties such as the Walking Purchase.
Bacon's Rebellion was a prime example of early resistance against the colonial government. Nathaniel Bacon started a rebellion against Governor William Berkeley because Berkeley would not allow the colonists to take more land from the natives.
While religion in some ways did divide the colonists, some religious groups, such as the Puritans, who created the New England Halfway Covenant, did make concessions to try and become more accepting of people of different faiths.
Very early on, a sense of superiority formed in the colonies as a result of the idealism of the colonists in their new land, which many of them saw as a sanctuary of freedom. This is depicted in John Winthrop's speech where he says, "The Lord make it that of New England, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us."
Religion changed over time in the colonies, varying in intensity from decade to decade. The First Great Awakening was a movement of religious revival in the 1730s which swept through the evangelical population.
In 1756, the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, broke out. This war saw the European colonies attempt to spread into the Ohio River Valley, which was controlled at the time by France. This saw the colonial landscape change dramatically in the north. Many settlers were outraged after the war because the proclamation of 1763 restricted them from moving into the land that they had just conquered.
In the lead-up to the American Revolution, several events sparked public outcry which caused many formal loyalists to become patriots. The Stamp Act was a British attempt to raise tax dollars to pay off the war debt. This act required a stamp on all official documents and was wildly unpopular, especially among lawyers and the print media, who were able by trade to be very vocal in their opposition.
Colonists were also upset about the tea tax, which incited the Boston Tea Party, where millions of dollars worth of tea, adjusted for inflation, were dumped into Boston Harbor. Britain responded with the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Harbor Act closed the port and hurt the colonial economy. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the government to interfere with trials of government officials, and the Massachusetts Government Act took away the colony's charter and put it under the British military rule.
Writers such as Thomas Paine also contributed to the shift in colonial sentiments. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, was widely distributed and called for a republican government, which was a new principle at the time. The lead-up to the Revolution culminated with Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
The test won't focus on the specifics of the war. However, what's important to remember is that it was fought between the British and the colonists. Both sides tried to recruit Native Americans, and the British offered freedom to slaves who fought for them in the war. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783.
Many Americans today believe that the American Constitution was the first government after the war, but this is simply not the case. The first government after the war was the Articles of Confederation. The AOC failed after just a decade because it did not unite the colonies under one government. The AOC set up no means to collect federal taxes or regulate commerce between the colonies. The AOC could also not pass an amendment without a unanimous vote, which meant that nothing got done. Eventually it became clear to the Founding Fathers and governors that a new government was needed, and this brings us to the Constitutional Convention. The convention was originally intended to revise the AOC. However, after the convention was finished, the United States Constitution had been formed.
In the beginning, there were two main political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong central government with control of the states, and was opposed to the addition of the Bill of Rights. It was in favor of the ratification of the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists wanted to protect states' rights They wanted the Bill of Rights, and they opposed the ratification of the new Constitution. In order to get the Constitution passed, Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers.
After ratification, Washington became the first president. In his farewell address, Washington spoke of isolationism, saying, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. It must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities." This will become very important later, as it was in Washington's statement which set the guidelines for American foreign policy in the next century through Wilson's presidency. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine solidified in writing America's isolationist views towards Europe.
The first anti-federalist president was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson dreamed of an agrarian democracy where Americans could be free to live unburdened by the government. At this time, Britain and France were once again at war, and this caused Britain to tighten its grip on the seas. The imprisonment of American sailors led Jefferson to impose his embargo. Jefferson's embargo caused a massive decline in European trade, which forced Americans to begin to manufacture their own goods. This unintended consequence was contrary to Jefferson's ideals. Jefferson was once again forced to reconcile his idea of strict constructionalism when Napoleon presented him with the opportunity for the Louisiana Purchase.
Also at this time, the Supreme Court began to enter the forefront of U.S. political discourse. John Marshall, who had been appointed by John Adams, rapidly began to expand the court's power through cases such as Marbury v. Madison. This gave the court the power of judicial review and ensured the court's relevance throughout U.S. history.
By 1812, the British Navy was continuing to impress American sailors. This, on top of the British aid provided to natives on the frontier, led to the War of 1812. The war was an abject failure in that British went on to impress American sailors, and no land changed hands.
After the War of 1812, the debate over abolition began to take over much of the political discourse. With the admission of new states to the Union, the Missouri Compromise allowed for the continuation of the slave-free state balance.
Around this point in time, Andrew Jackson entered American politics. Despite his use of the spoils system, which was giving jobs to friends and financial backers, he ran as a champion of the common man. Jackson was strongly against Native American rights. He wanted to displace Native Americans to make way for American settlers. Jackson forced the immigration of thousands of Cherokee Native Americans to Oklahoma in an event known as the Trail of Tears. Jackson passed several tariffs in his presidency, which angered South Carolina. John C. Calhoun led the charge that states had the right to nullify any act of Congress that they found unconstitutional. Jackson attempted to respond with the threat of force. In the end, the tariff was repealed. Feminism was evolving in the 19th century. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 demanded gender equality for women both through legal representation and through domestic liberties. One of the main goals of the convention was to shift away from the cult of domesticity, which was a strict set of gender roles which held to the oppressive ideal that women belong in the home.
In the lead-up to the Civil War, Manifest Destiny was still pushing America to gain new territory. In Mexico, the future state of Texas was home to many American settlers. These settlers, who wished to become part of the United States, seceded from Mexico, and this incited the Mexican-American War. At war's end, America had gained Texas, California, and New Mexico under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and this leads us to the Compromise of 1850.
The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state and outlawed the slave trade in the District of Columbia. However, this act enacted a more brutal fugitive slave law and gave no guidelines to the future of slavery in other states. This issue was dealt with in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which brought with it the idea of popular sovereignty. After the Compromise of 1850, despite the harsher fugitive slave law, efforts were still being made by abolitionists like Harriet Tubman to help slaves escape by ways of the Underground Railroad.
There were many other events which led up to the Civil War. Among these was the Dred Scott case of 1857, where Dred Scott, who was a slave, was taken by his master into a free state where Scott should have legally been free. Scott sued for his freedom. However, the court ruled in one of the worst Supreme Court rulings of all time that slaves were private property and were therefore legally allowed to be taken into any state. Several main abolitionists to know for the test are William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and W.E.B. Du Bois.
In the Civil War, each side had many advantages and disadvantages. The North had a more extensive railway network, a larger navy, and more industrial infrastructure. They also had less experienced generals. The South had a more experienced military and was fighting in their own territory. However, they had a smaller industrial society.
After the war, three of the most significant constitutional amendments in U.S. history were passed, kicking off the era of Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in any form in all states. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born within the United States, and the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to African American men. Unfortunately, it would not be until 1920 with the 19th Amendment that women got the right to vote.
After the Civil War, the nation entered in the era of Reconstruction as social and political reforms were made in response to the Civil War. During the war, as a gesture of national unity, Lincoln made Andrew Johnson his VP, even though he was a Democrat. When Lincoln was assassinated, this put the Democrat as chief executive to oversee the Southern reforms.
In the South, newly enfranchised African Americans became very politically active. In this period, known as Radical Reconstruction, these new African American legislators, along with their Northern Republican colleagues, passed many progressive reforms. This wave of reform soon came to an end as whites in the South found ways to continue to disenfranchise African Americans through voter ID laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, and the Grandfather Clause.
After Reconstruction, America's industrial economy began to rapidly expand as the Gilded Age began. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, transporting goods was easier than ever. Corporations adopted different strategies for growth. For example, Carnegie Steel expanded via vertical integration, whereas Rockefeller Standard Oil expanded via horizontal integration.
In the Gilded Age, labor unions emerged to protect the workers who were being mistreated by the unregulated industries. The most prominent labor unions to know are the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, and the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor eventually disappeared after the Haymarket Square bombings, which were blamed on union extremists.
Political corruption was rampant in the Gilded Age, and extremely powerful people, including the likes of Boss Tweed, would buy votes. Many political and economic figures justified their practices by using this argument of social Darwinism, implying that the success was related to the idea of survival of the fittest.
Near the end of the Gilded Age, immigration patterns changed, and the new wave of immigrants mostly came from Eastern Europe. They were met with negative nativist sentiments. Chinese immigration was also prevalent, especially on the West Coast. These immigrants were met with racism on the political stage. This was the case with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882.
After many years of the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era began, and it brought with it much-needed reforms. Muckrakers, who were usually journalists and photographers, exposed malpractices in industry and politics. For example, notable muckraker Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which exposed the truths about the meatpacking industry. Reforms like these would not have happened without progressive politicians like Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt preached his 3 C's of conservation, consumer protection, and corporations. This is similar to FDR's 3 R's, which were relief, reform, and recovery.
Roosevelt sought to expand U.S. territory and control. This can be seen through Roosevelt's building of the Panama Canal and his heavy-handed approach to other foreign policy. Due to the treatment of Cubans and Filipinos by the Spanish, accompanied by the sinking of the Maine off the coast of Cuba, the U.S. entered the Spanish-American War. Although the sinking of the ship was not caused by Spain, many Americans thought it was, and so the chant, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," rung out. The war ended fairly quickly, and although the U.S. lost control of the Philippines afterwards, the U.S. hung on to Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, etc. When Roosevelt quit, he left the nation with William Howard Taft, who disappointed Roosevelt with his policy of dollar diplomacy so much that Roosevelt challenged him in the election of 1912 as a member of the Bull Moose Party, which Roosevelt founded. Roosevelt and Taft split the vote, and Wilson won the election.
Woodrow Wilson was an isolationist, and he desperately wanted to stay out of the war in Europe. However, this was not really an option for him after the Germans resumed their submarine patrols in the U.S. Allies' waters, and the Zimmermann telegram was received, which threatened national security of the United States because it said that Germany would aid Mexico in gaining back California if Mexico were to help Germans in their war efforts.
So there you have it, 500 years of history in 10 minutes.
Hopefully this was helpful to review, and we hope to see you all here again on Tech Time.